Right. Well, welcome for the third of the third of the winter lecture series here at the Gothic Centre. Tonight we've got our colleague Matthew Carter. Matthew Carter is a senior lecturer in film here at Manchester Metropolitan, and he is the author of Myth of the Western: New Perspectives on Hollywood's Frontier Narrative, which came out from Edinburgh University Press in 2014, and co-editor with Andrew Patrick Nelson of the films of Delma Daves, which also came out from Edinburgh in 2015. And that was as part of their Refocus series on neglected American filmmakers. He has co-edited two-issue journals, special issue journals, and has published variously on westerns, science fiction, and horror for numerous journals and edited collections. His current project is a co-authored study with Andrew Patrick Nelson of the films of Toby Hooper for Columbia University Press as part of the Director's Cuts series. And I believe that it is from this particular book that today's paper, This House Has Many Hearts, The Incoherence of Poltergeist, is stemming from. So thank you so much, Matt. Over to you.
Thanks, Avi. Okay. So tonight I'm going to outline some of the research that I and my colleague Andy Patrick Nelson from the University of Utah have been undertaking on and off for the past few years now for a cohort study of the complete works of the American filmmaker Toby Hooper. The book, provisionally entitled In Massacre's Shadow, will be the first such study of the director's complete works, and as Xavi said, is currently under contract with Columbia University Press. Tonight's focus on the 1982 film Poltergeist will mainly consist of a go-through of some of the critical literature on the film and the controversies surrounding its production, namely the long-running questions surrounding the extent of Toby Hooper's artistic input into the film. These questions were driven by rumors that the film's named writer and co-producer, Steven Spielberg, was the real creative force behind the film. In this sense, Poltergeist is an anomaly in Hooper's body of work, mainly because of this controversy over who really authored it. First, I want to show how the film fits into the broader scope of our thesis. Sean, tonight, I think you'll be glad to know of any of its more esoteric theoretical compositions. Thus, I shall outline our research on Hooper in a very general sense, so as to provide a suitable context within which to place the film. I should add, as an important aside, this lecture will not offer a summative analysis of our reading of Poltergeist, because the chapter from which it draws its material is still very much at the reading and collation of the critical literature phase, so don't expect revelations. When we first considered this project, there were no major retrospective studies of Hooper's films. The only exception was the very entertaining 2009 book, Eaten Alive at a Chainsaw Massacre, by the prolific film critic and journalist John Kenneth Muir, which, while it takes an encyclopedic approach to Hooper's films, it gives little attention to overarching themes and little engagement with existing criticism of the filmmaker. It is fair to say, though, that in recent years, more academics are turning their critical lenses onto certain aspects of his work, with a number of interesting essays and reviews being published. This indication of increasing interest in Hooper has been substantiated with a 2021 publication of the first single volume devoted to his films, a compilation of essays entitled American Twilight, edited by Christopher Woofter and Will Dodson. It represents an important contribution to greater appreciation of his work. The issues raised by the essays in this volume stimulate deeper insights into Hooper's films. It is overall an excellent edited collection, but as an edited collection, it can only go some way toward rectifying Hooper's hitherto neglected status. And the issues Hooper's films raise, we believe, warrant examination with the depth and focus that a monograph permits. Our purpose essentially is to offer a comprehensive introduction to an examination of Hooper's whole body of work. Proceeding roughly chronologically from his early independent films through his troubled studio work and back to independent filmmaking, this time supported by series television assignments, we aim to discuss how Hooper's movies came to be produced, the thoughts and expertise that went into their making, and their place in the development of the horror genre. The study will combine auteur and ideological analyses with a contemporary thesis that incorporates intermedial and reflectionist approaches and ways of thinking that consider ever-shifting and alternative modes of media reception. For instance, Hooper's difficulties throughout the 90s and 2000s, up to and including his struggle to find a wide release for his final movie, Gin, in 2013, and his publication of a novel in 2011 called Midnight Movie, which revisits his reshooting of a lost 1959 student film, points to Hooper's role in the ever-evolving methods by which horror is produced and consumed, and of the subcultures through which it is discussed and assessed. With horror auteurs like Hooper frequently denied the opportunity to diversify in their late careers, we relate his struggle to new generic cultures characterized by diverse and diffuse and increasingly digital contexts of production and reception rather than centralized production and mass appeal. This is at its heart the story of a neglected filmmaker, basically the work of Hooper, who, in our opinion, was certainly a talented artist with a distinct worldview, has until recently been largely neglected in academia, even among horror scholars. When Hooper is discussed, a few notable exceptions notwithstanding, it is primarily for two films, neither of which tell his whole story, and both of which tend to smother discussion of the other important contributions he made to the development of American horror cinema. The director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. This is the reputation of Tobe Hooper, a career distilled not simply to two movies, one a fluke, the other not really his, but to a tagline affixed from the mid-1980s onward to a series of increasingly obscure horror movies. This reputation persists and demands correction. Our contention is that Hooper was not a one or two hit wonder, but as exploration of his lesser known and overlooked films demonstrates, rather a politically progressive, historically minded horror auteur whose films reflected the genre back to itself. As such, we look to offer an account of how Hooper quietly resisted the reactionary mainstreaming of American horror that followed the independent exploitation films of the late 60s and early 70s. The November 7th, 1988 issue of People magazine provides us with a suitable point of entry for discussing Hooper's place within contemporary horror film discourse. It features one of the most famous images in the history of horror cinema. It depicts a sort of nightmare Thanksgiving with a dining room festooned not with turkey and all the trimmings, but severed heads and hands, dead leaves, smashed pumpkins, and a corpse lie on the floor. And the guests at this macabre feast, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and Leatherface, who was, of course, the nominal fetish monster from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The accompanying article details how it was a bloody good year again for horror movies, with record box office for the genre spurred by new entries in the Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, all of which leaves Leatherface the odd man out. His only sequel, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, was released 2 years earlier to negative reviews and weak box office. It was 170 degrees, relays Leatherface actor Bob Elmore, referencing how different the 1986 sequel was from the original 1974 film. But I destroyed a Mercedes, killed lots of people, and cut a guy's head off. So that was real nice. The uneasiness with which Leatherface stands in the modern pantheon of horror monsters points to two similarly uneasy arrangements: the place of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the modern horror canon, and the place of Tobe Hooper among that canon's masters of horror. Of all Hooper's output, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is by far the most discussed in film criticism. A low-budget exploitation picture that ultimately played at Cannes, the film remains a benchmark of American horror. In contrast to the auteur-focused nature of most writing on 1970s and 80s horror cinema, which foregrounds the roles of directors like George Romero, John Carpenter, Wes Craven, and David Cronenberg, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is rarely examined within the larger framework of Hooper's corpus of films. Without denying Hooper credit for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the director's inability to follow up with significant new work, combined with the widely held belief that Spielberg took over the direction of Poltergeist, is taken as evidence of Hooper's ultimately limited capabilities as a filmmaker. This has reached a point where, to adapt Peter Wallen's terminology in Signs and Meaning in the Cinema, Tobe Hooper, the director, has not so much become methodologically confused with the structures named after him. Rather, the structures themselves have become confused with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as if the structures of this single film are both the man and the man's works. How ideas about horror authorship have distorted our understanding, not only of Hooper's career, but perhaps the genre at large, is an important undercurrent of our argument. From the outset, Andy and I knew that examinations of broader issues of cinematic authorship and those that apply specifically to Hooper needed to be paired with an historical account of the development of American horror cinema from the 70s to the 2000s, ensuring that Hooper's stylistic proclivities and thematic preoccupations are never divorced from the shifting context that shaped the production of his films. This approach opens up space to deal with his critically neglected work like Eggshells from 1969, but also films like Eaten Alive from 76, his numerous low-budget genre features of the late 80s and early 90s, films like Spontaneous Combustion and I'm Dangerous Tonight, as well as later works like The Toolbox Murders and Mortuary, which we'll argue are important overlooked works that warrant revaluation. Even less successful efforts like The Mangler from 95 and Crocodile from 2000 still evidence Hooper's ongoing self-aware engagement with the history of horror cinema. Our overall aim is to establish Hooper's place within contemporary horror film discourse, to explain how his reputation came about and how it is perpetuated, and offer an alternative vision of his films, as a reflection less of our shifting cultural anxieties than of the anxieties of the horror film itself, chief among them that the genre and its practitioners somehow betrayed the revolutionary spirit of films like Romero's Night of the Living Dead, Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, and of Hooper's own Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Surveying the vast literature on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we aim to untangle Hooper from his creation by scrutinizing prevailing interpretations of the film as a post-Vietnam return of the rural repressed, situating it instead within the context of Hooper's early career as a Texas-based documentarian and experimental filmmaker. To this end, we are looking at his early shorts, The Heisters from 64 and Down Friday Street from 66, the aforementioned Eggshells, and the documentary Peter, Paul and Mary, The Song is Love from 1971. All of which in various ways laid the formal and thematic foundations upon which Texas Chainsaw Massacre stands. We'll also recover overlooked aspects of the film, like its humor, its sympathy for certain monstrous characters, and the coincidental nature of evil, all of which point to continuities with Hooper's later films. In interviews following the release of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hooper spoke optimistically of going on to make movies in all genres, but his path was set and only more horror movies were in the offering. Hooper followed up with a series of films that reinvented traditional horror monsters: the captive man-eating creature seen in Eaten Alive, the vampire in 1979's TV miniseries Salem's Lot, which was Hooper's first and most successful foray into television, the disfigured monster from the Funhouse in 1981, all of which culminated in the haunted house blockbuster Poltergeist. Building on themes from his pre-Poltergeist films saw Hooper elaborate his sympathetic intertextual treatment of monstrous characters and continue to locate the monstrous within conventional social institutions, in growing contrast to the shifting sensibilities of the horror movie. This contrast, we argue, results in the tensions, both textual and extra-textual, of Poltergeist, which pitted Spielberg and his vision of suburbia as a last bastion of family values against Hooper's subtle insistence that the family is the source of monstrosity. This point of divergence on the subject of the family provides an important context for understanding early criticism of Poltergeist, which treated it rather straightforwardly as a Spielberg film, with critics disparaging what they saw as its superficial defense of the suburban family home from the malevolent forces of post-modernity. One of these early critics was Robin Wood, whose highly influential general thesis on the modern American horror film locates the family as the place where patriarchal repression operates most clearly and effectively. He associates patriarchy with capitalism and sees two categories of horror film: the progressive and the reactionary. The progressive horror film he associates most directly with the radical political activism of the late 60s and early 70s, the period of Vietnam and Watergate, a moment of, quote, generalized crisis in ideological confidence, which temporarily released our culture's monsters from the shackles of repression. It was during this period that horror becomes associated with its true milieu, the family, and whereby many notable films became explicit in their depiction of the monstrousness of patriarchal family structures. Such films for Wood are progressive in their specific opposition to patriarchy and capitalism, and in their ability to challenge the inhumanity of societal injustice. Preeminent among Wood's examples of such films is Hooper's own Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Against this, he describes the reactionary horror film, which, although always a powerful tradition in American horror, emerged most forcefully toward the end of the 70s and came to dominate the ideological tenor of the genre's output throughout the 80s. For Wood, the reactionary horror film is aligned with the rise of conservative politics, most readily associated with Ronald Reagan, who entered the White House in 1981. This was, as Wood describes it, an era of recuperation and reassurance following a tumultuous period of cultural crisis. In short, reactionary horror films reinforce dominant ideology, deny the possibility of social change, and reinforce repression. One of the films Wood cites as an example of this trend, funnily enough, is Poltergeist. It is tempting, he pronounces, to dismiss it simply as Tobe Hooper's worst film, but it clearly belongs to the Spielberg oeuvre rather than to Hooper's. For Wood, the interest in the particular brand of reassurances it offers both lie in its relation to the 70s family horror film and the way in which Spielberg enlists the genre's potential radicalism and perverts it into 80s conservatism. Thus, it constitutes an attempt to absolve the American family from all responsibility for the horror. As he explains, in the 1970s, the monster was located within the family, perceived as its logical product. Poltergeist appears at first to be toying with this concept before declaring the family innocent and locating the monstrous elsewhere. Wood concludes by stating that the suburban bourgeois nuclear family remains the best of all possible worlds, if only because any other is simply beyond Spielberg's imagination. Andrew Britton, in his 1986 essay, Blissing Out, The Politics of Reaganite Entertainment, similarly argues that the portrayal of the family in Poltergeist, the father, Stephen, a successful realtor, his suitably modern but traditionally dutiful wife, Diane, and their three children, the teenager Dana and young children Robbie and Carol Ann, reinforce the dominant ideology of patriarchy and capitalism, and is ultimately complicit with a general movement of reaction and conservative reassurance in the contemporary Hollywood cinema. Britton also associates Poltergeist directly with Spielberg, and this makes it easier for him to critique. Nothing is easier, he chides, in the conventions of the horror thriller than to take the transcendent value of home and family completely for granted. Although it is a part of the function of the evil spirits in Poltergeist to enact an impulse to violate the very things to which the films are supposed to be committed, the image of suburban domesticity under threat is so potent and the narrative donnée so strong that the contradiction need not assert itself in any very damaging form. Here, a unified and homogeneous family is exposed to the bad offices of powers of evil, which have no significant relation to it, and which are defined as absolutely external to the order they disturb. In the end, Britton argues, whatever the symbolic content of the family's antagonists may be, the family itself is, according to Poltergeist, all right. Indeed, one need only visually compare the families from Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist to demonstrate the point. In the former, we see an example of what Doug Kellner calls the more socially critical films of the early 70s, which see monsters being produced by families and which articulate the critiques of the family in 60s political movements. On the other hand, films like Poltergeist show good families being attacked by monsters and thus serve as ideological defenses of the middle-class family, which transcode cinematically the conservative pro-family discourses of the 1980s. Kellner was the first scholar to pay Poltergeist significant attention, with articles published in Jump Cut and the Socialist Review in 1983. He followed these in 1996 with a summative essay entitled Poltergeist, Gender and Class in the Age of Reagan and Bush, from which I have just quoted. Throughout, Kellner associates Poltergeist with Spielberg, whom he describes as the dominant ideologue of affluent middle-class America. Linking Poltergeist to Close Encounters of the Third Kind from '77 and E.T., the Extraterrestrial from 1982, Kellner suggests that these films affectionately depict the commodity comforts offered by a consumer society and contain the fantasy that somehow beneficent forces will alleviate threats to our security and well-being. Kellner suggests that although he may or may not be a class-conscious ideologue, Spielberg's effectiveness as a purveyor of ideology derives from his identification with the affluent middle class and its way of life, which he appealingly reproduces. At the same time, Kellner maintains that if read diagnostically, even conservative horror films can reveal contemporary anxieties concerning the family, downward mobility, and homelessness in an uncertain economy and disintegrating social order. Thus, he suggests Poltergeist be read allegorically as an articulation of the underlying anxieties of the new middle class in the age of Reagan. For him, this allegory clothes itself in the language of the occult, and he describes Spielberg's fuzzy-minded occultism as being marked by ambiguities which characterize his ideological problematic as a whole, observing how on the one hand it is used to present rational contemporary fears, while on the other it serves as a vehicle to promote sentimental irrationalism. With Close Encounters, Poltergeist, and E.T., Spielberg constructs a spiritualist metaphysics out of representations of beneficent aliens, extrasensory perception, spirits, poltergeists, and magic, all of which feed an already rampant irrationalism in US society and serve to deflect people's legitimate fears onto irrational forces. In an essay published in 1987, Charles Derry reads Poltergeist in context with what he calls the horror of the demonic, a genre cycle in which he observes regressive ideological developments from the late 70s. Thus, Poltergeist is a remarkably benign film and considerably reactionary film that views American suburban life as predominantly good and demonic spirits as anomalous and vanquishable. To which end he notes that parents are loving and nurturing, conventional consumerism is valorized rather than criticized, and violence is unambiguously derived from outside the political structures of the family. Meanwhile, Tony Williams observed how Poltergeist begins with a promising visual exploration of the darkness within the family home, but soon degenerates into the infantile mindset of typical Spielbergia. Under the overwhelming aegis of which he argues the film succeeds in oppressing any of the differences Tobe Hooper intended. As such, Poltergeist singularly fails to interrogate potentially destabilizing images from within the family dynamic, about which Williams lists Robbie's fascination with death, Ronald Reagan's image on a magazine cover, and Debbie's, he means Dana's, sexual experiences unknown to the family, all of which he claims are smothered under the film's smug ideological project. He concludes by stating that Poltergeist banally succeeds in its ideologic aim of reuniting the family and blaming convenient scapegoats. What is clear from early scholarship on Poltergeist is a demonstration of the sumptuous tendencies that have coalesced into a definite analytical paradigm, one which has informed a powerful academic consensus made up of interrelated elements. First, that the film be understood as authorially, thematically Spielbergian, and frequently considered alongside E.T. and Close Encounters. Second, that it be placed in the cultural context of a reactionary Reaganite political economy. Third, that it reaffirms the traditional family structure now situated within the contemporary cultural geography of affluent consumerist suburbia. The family appears the most important of these elements. Assailed by supernatural threats that are external to it, the Freelings are assigned the most significant role in the film's symbolic expressiveness. However, one alternative perspective from this period managed to seep through the cracks of this powerful academic consensus. In a 1995 article entitled Subterranean Suburbia, Underneath the Small Town Myth in the Two Versions of Invaders from Mars, Rob Latham tentatively draws Poltergeist back into the contested authorial space. In so doing, he can be said to have provided one of the first counter-conventional readings of the film. As the title of his essay suggests, however, Poltergeist is not Latham's primary concern, although Hooper and the Suburban Project certainly are, because the 1986 remake of the 1953 film Invaders from Mars was directed by Hooper. In a short but instructive section of his essay, and making specific reference to Kellner, Derry, and Wood, Latham observes how virtually every critic of the film has attributed Poltergeist on the basis of its animating vision of suburbia to Spielberg, and in the process attacking it. He counters by suggesting that Poltergeist demonstrates its uneasy alliance between Spielberg's confidence in the suburban project and Hooper's corrosive contempt for bourgeois institutions. Widening the ideology critique to encompass socially critical elements and oppositional moments, Latham perceives a far more complex text than critics had hitherto allowed for. Accordingly, he insists that far more so than any other movie in the Spielberg canon, Poltergeist at least suggests the price of exclusion upon which the suburban domestic idyll is based. In support of this assertion, Latham points to anxieties about the literal firmness of suburbia's moral ground. He also suggests that the conventional provenance of Poltergeist as emerging from within the family structure suggests an altogether less positive vision of the relationship between parents and children is as much minatory as it is celebratory. Finally, drawing the film back to its social historical context, Latham points to a real estate culture of uncontrolled speculation, which was at the time pricing younger Americans out of the market. As such, he notes how one can perceive disturbing economic subtexts lurking beneath the film's portrait of a well-meaning boomer couple who cannot protect their children from the social costs of their own affluence. Following Latham, later critics began to acknowledge some of the film's ambiguities, but without crediting Hooper. For example, Andrew M. Gordon sees the film as essentially a part of what he calls Spielberg's suburban trilogy, which includes Close Encounters and E.T., primarily because all three, quote, feature the invasion of average middle-class households by strange forces and the kidnapping of children, and end with reunion or transcendence. Gordon teases out many nuances from Poltergeist, but the title of his book, Empire of Dreams, the science fiction and fantasy films of Steven Spielberg, make the provenance, as far as he sees it, of Poltergeist very clear. Another scholar who develops Poltergeist's ambiguities in some detail is James Kendrick. He reads the film as the dark shadow of E.T. in his 2008 study, Hollywood Bloodshed. Throughout, Kendrick forwards the more modern critical conception of Spielberg not as a director of films whose espousal of neoconservative values ultimately reassures, but whose conservative values apparent at the surface level are undermined by the presence of transgressive ideological subtexts. Kendrick also criticizes Robin Wood, arguing that what Wood doesn't see is that the horror in Poltergeist isn't radical because of its source, that is something external rather than within the family itself, but rather because it cannot be defeated. Kendrick also rebukes Kellner's contention that Poltergeist has a traditional happy ending because the family survives together and wholly intact. True, the family survives in the end and remains intact, but as he points out, the family's survival is only in the most basic physical meaning of the word. They are still alive. The Poltergeists have clearly won in the sense that they successfully drove the family out of the house, and their work done folded the house in on itself, leaving only a gaping scar in the suburban neighborhood. I don't disagree with Kendrick's analysis of Spielberg as a filmmaker at all. Indeed, some of his points were made as well by Murray Leeder in his excellent essay, also from 2008, entitled The Fall of the House of Meaning, Between Static and Slime in Poltergeist, in which Leeder chides Kellner's inability to detect any cynicism in the film, even if the earlier critic accepted the film as part of Spielberg's canon. As an aside, Leeder at least holds the door open to suggestions that the film could be read as Hooper's, even though he does not follow this up, deeming it largely an unresolvable distraction, while concluding that the film has an obvious divided, inconsistent quality, which we may or may not attribute to contested authorship. Leeder's essay, in fact, helpfully suggests the limitations, as he perceives them, in the existing scholarship on Poltergeist are rooted in the problem of authorship. Scholars are unable to look beyond the question of its divided status or to consider it outside of Spielberg's canon. As if to prove the point, Kendrick's later study, 2014's Darkness in the Bliss Out, a reconsideration of the films of Steven Spielberg, states the following. Even if the question of who truly directed Poltergeist is never fully answered, Spielberg was clearly an important creative force in shaping the film out of ideas that originated with him, which more than justifies its inclusion alongside Close Encounters and E.T. as one of his most important and revealing films. There follows excellent observations about the conflicts and contradictions in Spielberg's view of contemporary suburban existence, including a sense of perversity and of the illusory nature of the safety it espouses, with the suburban trilogy leaving questions about the family and ordinary life curiously open-ended. On Poltergeist specifically, Kendrick observes, for instance, the freaky trees interspersed with the film's suburban setting as a curious mix of Gothic and pastoral. And there you go, I've managed to slip the word Gothic in once. And describes the home itself as being not a place of safety, but rather of intense vulnerability. Overall, Kendrick makes the point that the films comprising Spielberg's suburban trilogy are far darker, and his view of suburban nuclear family life, surrounded by the plastic junk of weekend America, less rosy than previous critics like Wood and Britton et al. Had allowed for. Ultimately, what we appear to be left with from this more recent scholarship, accepting leader, is a corrective of an earlier paradigm. This is good, of course, but the new formula that replaces the old is equally frustrating. So to boil it down to its essentials, early criticism has it that Poltergeist is a bad film because Spielberg was an ideologically problematic director. More recent criticism argues that Poltergeist is a good film because Spielberg is a far more complex director than earlier critics had allowed for. What gets lost in all of this is the role and influence of Tobe Hooper. Kendrick, for his part, and despite the otherwise excellence of his study, seems to preclude the possibility that the sinister elements he cleverly extracts from Poltergeist could be attributed, at least in part, to Tobe Hooper. So, as we can see, as much as Hooper struggled to emerge from the shadow of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he failed to crawl out from under the long shadow cast by Spielberg and Poltergeist. Which leads us on to the controversy over the question of authorship. So let me briefly address this. Rumors of Spielberg being a little hands-on on the set of Poltergeist originated, as many know, in an article by Dale Pollock in the May 24th, 1982 edition of the Los Angeles Times, shortly before the release of the film in cinemas. The film's co-producer, Frank Marshall, suggests that Spielberg was, quote, the creative force on this movie, end quote, going on to say that Spielberg did the design for every storyboard and he was on set every day. Spielberg concurred, claiming that the film derived from my imagination and my experiences, and it came out of my typewriter. I thought I'd be able to give Poltergeist over to a director and walk away. I was wrong. Things got worse as Spielberg said, Tobe isn't what you'd call a take charge sort of guy. He's just not a strong presence on a movie set. If a question was asked and an answer wasn't immediately forthcoming, I'd jump in and say what we could do. Tobe would nod agreement, and that became the process of collaboration. I did not want to direct the movie. I had to do E.T. 5 weeks after principal photography on Poltergeist. Furthermore, and according to film critic Richard Roud, in an earlier interview and film comment, Spielberg had admitted that he designed the film from the storyboards to post-production. I'm saying, he goes on, that I was the David Selznick of the film. I won't go any further on a limb. I'll just say that I functioned in a strong way. When asked why he didn't direct it himself, he replied that he was doing E.T. and, you know, it's sort of illegal to direct 2 movies at the same time. Before long, the Directors Guild of America set up an investigation to ascertain what went wrong. The controversy wasn't helped when the trailer for the film minimized Hooper's involvement, asserting the name Steven Spielberg throughout and rendering it in bolder font and placing it above that of Hooper in the credits. This led MGM being ordered to pay Hooper $15,000, as well as publish a full-page apology for the unintended error. As well, Spielberg put out a full-page apology to Hooper in Variety, asserting his regrets that, quote, some of the press misunderstood the rather unique creative relationship that he shared with Hooper during the making of the film. But the damage to Hooper's reputation and ultimately his career was done. While the exact level of Hooper's authorial influence on the film remains a matter of conjecture, as proof that once something gets into the water, it never leaves, it has continued as a debate some 40 years after the film was first released, and has evidently been taken as, as confirmation enough by many that the film belongs as part of Spielberg's oeuvre. One of our concerns for including this film in what is essentially an uncontroversial auteur study of the films of Tobe Hooper is precisely because the authorship in this case is contested, i.e. it is a controversy. At the same time, we couldn't rightly leave it out any more than we could leave out Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Considering that Poltergeist could be treated as a Hooper film through the narrative of divided authorship, we didn't, and others didn't want the chapter to read simply as a critical exercise, which I admit a large portion of this lecture has read precisely as such. So we realized that our argument would be strongest if it brought some new evidence to bear, indicating that Hooper did have more creative influence on Poltergeist than generally thought. Our research has included an exhaustive review of not only the scholarly and journalistic writing on Hooper and his films, but industry and fan publications as well. This has turned up many sources, including interviews with the filmmaker hereto uncited in criticism, so far as we know. To offer just one tonight, an interview about Poltergeist that Hooper gave to Bob Martin for Fangoria magazine on November 23rd, 1982. Herein, Hooper discusses the production of the film and the ensuing controversy over its authorship, along with the origins of the project, according to him. Martin states quite explicitly that he and his team had to abandon the list of questions they'd prepared on Poltergeist. Based on what they thought they knew, their questions simply didn't relate to Hooper's conception of his role as the film's director. Hooper claimed that he had a long-standing interest in ghosts going all the way back to when he lived in Texas. He claimed to have been working on Poltergeist since 1974, when he first came to Hollywood under the patronage of his mentor, the filmmaker William Friedkin. When I got a Universal development contract at the time, he says, I just happened to get Bob Wise's office. He had just moved out and he had left a book behind, and the title of that book was Poltergeist. I talked to Friedkin about it, and he and I were going to present to Universal a picture about poltergeist phenomena. I went on to other projects with Friedkin, but continued working on Poltergeist on and off for 8 years. Hooper then goes on to state that Spielberg, quote, wanted me to do a follow-up to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the film that eventually came to be E.T., though what he described was very different. I explained to him that really wasn't my kind of thing, but I'd always wanted to do a film about ghosts and poltergeists. He said, fantastic. And at that point, we set about creating Poltergeist. We worked on it in London while he was shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark. So I have literally been on this project for 8 years. In fact, states the journalist Martin, Hooper is far from pleased by the interviews with Poltergeist producers that have suggested that his role as a director was more technical than it was creative. It seemed to me that the relationship between Steve and I, he says, was analogous to the relationship between George Lucas and Steven on Raiders of the Lost Ark. I thought at the time it was one of the best working relationships I'd ever had between a producer and director, and all this was news to me. It came to my attention just a few days before the picture was released. I think it's really a shame. It's been personally damaging, and it's certainly knocked me out of competition for the Academy Awards this year. It's a tough business. This is one amongst many Phillips we've uncovered, and overall we feel we have ample material to construct a historical counter-narrative about Hooper's involvement, not only in the production of Poltergeist, but in its conception as well. Following the debacle of Poltergeist, Hooper signed a 3-movie deal with the Cannon Group, Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. Not only is there an argument to suggest that they emerged as a sustained reaction to the early 80s mainstreaming of 70s horror, but we read his remake of Invaders from Mars as the anti-E.T., and more broadly as Hooper's response to the 1980s family sci-fi fantasy film. We argue that Hooper was deliberately defying audience expectations, a strategy that reached its apogee with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, his only ever sequel, and a film in which his formal inventions reached a high point, even if his box office did not. These and the rest of Hooper's films remind us that in order to fully understand a single film, such as Poltergeist, within a director's body of work, one must consider exactly that, the whole body of work, the works that came before and those that came after. In this sense, due note is taken of Peter Wallen's contention that it is only the analysis of the whole corpus which permits the moment of synthesis when the critic returns to the individual film. This statement comes as perilously close, to my mind at least, as academic film theory gets to those famous lines from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding from the Four Quartets. So I shall rather pretentiously close out this lecture with those lines to let you know where my head is at currently with Poltergeist. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Thank you very much.